Hey, Bastish B here for 64K and welcome to another episode of my new documentary series.
Welcome to 64K, hosted by Bastish B.
And welcome back. So in today's episode I'm going to be having a look at all the Ghostbusters games released on the Commodore 64. But before we go ahead with that, let's take a brief little look at the history of the franchise. Ghostbusters is a movie franchise that started its life back in 1984 with the release of the original comedy classic movie starring comedian heavyweights Bill Murray, Dan Aykroyd, and Harold Ramis, and a fantastic supporting cast including Ernie, I've been in so many movies but I bet you can't name one, Hudson, Rick, I usually act with Shrunken Kids and Homicidal Plants, Moranis, and Sigourney, I can't seem to make a movie without Slime, Weaver. It was a massive hit and spawned the 1989 direct sequel imaginatively titled Ghostbusters 2, which although financially successful doesn't quite match up to the original's wit and charm.
That says you guys are full of crap.
It don't look good.
In between these movies, an extremely successful cartoon series was spawned called The Real Ghostbusters, which ran for 140 episodes in total over a 6-year span. As with all franchises, comic books and toys have constantly appeared over the years since its original movie release. Video games have also been an important part of keeping the franchise legacy alive, ranging from NES titles, Mega Drive, the arcade, etc., and we'll be delving into all the Commodore 64 games and movies in more detail soon. The franchise then lay dormant for almost 2 decades, with the occasional toy and comic book appearance until 2016's Ghostbusters revival movie.
My name is Erin Gilbert, Doctor of Particle Physics. That stuff went everywhere, by the way, in every crack. Very hard to wash off.
Which the less said about the better. So yeah, I was hoping that the upcoming or maybe already released movie by the time this video airs, Ghostbusters Afterlife, written by the original director's son, Jason Reitman, can return the movie franchise back to its glory days. Okay, and now that we got that out of the way, let's start looking at all 3 Commodore 64 games. We're going to be looking at the games plus the movies that inspired them. And if you haven't already, I've got a few other episodes out in the series so far. I've got one about James Bond, one about DC Comics, and one about 2080 Comics. So if you like this one, please check those out. Let's start playing these things. So let's jump back to 1984 with the original Ghostbusters game released by Activision, the same year the classic movie made its debut. The movie was directed by Ivan Reitman, who worked with Bill Murray and Harold Ramis previously on Stripes, and would go on to other much-loved comedy classics such as Twins, Kindergarten Cop, and of course, the sequel. The movie was originally written by Dan Aykroyd as another cinematic vehicle for him and John Belushi, following on from the Blues Brothers, and involved them time-traveling through history and busting ghosts. The movie was simply too ambitious and the studio needed the budget to be within reason. Unfortunately, John Belushi's untimely death also helped scrap this original version. Harold Ramis was then brought in to work with Aykroyd to retool the script into what it eventually became. Its initial theatrical run brought in almost $300 million for Columbia Pictures on a $30 million budget, making it one of the most successful comedies of that decade. It also spawned the #1 song Ghostbusters by Ray Parker Jr. that, as a kid of the 80s, you heard everywhere and everyone knew the words no matter who you were or where you're from. For me, it's one of the best movies of the 1980s, hands down. The combination of pitch-perfect casting,
Tell him about the Twinkie. What about the Twinkie?
extremely funny and witty dialogue,
Tell you what, I'll take Miss Barrett back to her apartment and check her out. I'll go check out Miss Barrett's apartment.
excellent traditional special effects, a memorable score, and overall originality just shines through all the way.
We came, we saw, we kicked its ass.
And back to Activision's first of 3 Ghostbusters games, which was designed and programmed by one of their most talented programmers at the time, David Crane. David had a knack for making really original, well-made games, as seen with the excellent Pitfall and, of course, Little Computer People, which is basically The Sims a decade and a half earlier. I've mentioned this before in a video, but this game could have easily been some really trashy Pac-Man clone or a variation on an arcade game, which is exactly exactly what they used to do with movie license games at the time, at least until Ocean's multi-styled interpretations really kicked in. This game was a fully fledged Ghostbusters simulator, meaning you ran the business as well as busted ghosts, which really makes it feel like you were helping quell the ghost infestation of New York City. After you got your loan from the bank, you had to make a bunch of choices with your money. You have to decide on equipment to purchase and the vehicle you want to use. Then it's off to protect New York, driving your car to infested locations and capturing ghosts to keep the city under control. The chaos slowly starts to ramp up as more and more ghosts flood the city, forcing you to choose from one location over another until the inevitable showdown with Zool, just like the end of the movie. This is just such a classic, well-designed game from the moment it loads up and you're greeted with followed by the karaoke bouncing ball and a brilliant Sid version of the Ray Parker Jr. song. You know you're in for quality. Originality and good graphics, some really spectacular speech samples round out another brilliant game that complements the original movie in every single way. I played a lot of the other different versions of this game, and the C64 version is still head and shoulders better than the rest, so if you've never tried it, I would highly recommend it. Let's now jump ahead a few years to 1989, a year that saw Activision release not one but two Ghostbusters games in the same year. So let's start off with the Real Ghostbusters, which was based on two things, a 1987 Data East arcade game and the extremely popular cartoon series of the same name, which started in 1986 and ran for 7 seasons up until 1991, which is pretty much unheard of for cartoons at that time, and bowed out at 140 episodes in total, expanding on the Ghostbusters lore to really great effect.
Are we going to do a lot of running around, screaming and yelling and falling down and end up covered with slime?
Don't we always?
Just wanted to make sure.
They also formed a really good voiceover cast that complemented the movie really well, including the late Lorenzo Music, who would voice Peter Venkman, Bill Murray's character, and Lorenzo would later go on to voice Garfield in cartoon form, and after his passing, in a weird bit of irony, Bill Murray would go on to voice Garfield in the movie series. Comedian Arsenio Hall was also in there, and he managed to beat out Ernie Hudson for the role that Ernie Hudson originally played as Winston. How the heck did that happen? And of course, Uncle Joey himself.
Cut it out. Get out of here.
Dave Coulier rounded out a small portion of the talent involved. And you may be wondering why it was called The Real Ghostbusters. Well, at the time, Filmation released its own Ghostbusters series in 1986 in animation form based on a really obscure 1975 sitcom called Ghostbusters. Obviously, the timing was questionable, clearly trying to cash in on the new Ghostbusters franchise. The cartoon itself was clunky and it was nowhere near the quality of the Real Ghostbusters in terms of animation, charm, or definitely writing, and faded into obscurity after 65 episodes. The Real Ghostbusters then inspired, well, sort of, the 1987 Data East arcade game, which was a 1 to 3 player top-down run-and gun game, which honestly barely resembles the cartoon in any way, shape or form. And that's because in Japan, Data East published this game under the name Maikyuu Hunter G, and it had absolutely nothing to do with Ghostbusters whatsoever. When it was brought over to the US, the graphics were changed, and the Ghostbusters characters and music were added into the game to tie in with the license. It featured 10 levels of ghost blasting before facing off against a boss at the end of each level. All the ghosts captured would then be put into the ecto containment unit. Rinse, repeat. Overall, it's an okay arcade game that clearly wasn't meant to be a Ghostbusters game at all, and after playing it for 5 seconds you will be able to confirm that. But that didn't stop Activision from converting it to all major computer formats at the time. The C64 version fares up somewhere in the middle of all the conversions. It's neither great nor totally terrible, but something in the middle. In all fairness to this conversion though, it's based on a mediocre arcade game, so in some respects it's actually really good. The run and gun action feels pretty close to the arcade with some decent graphics and some pretty fun boss fights. The power-ups are all present, including the Slimer Ghost Protection. Where this game trumps the arcade completely though is in the Ghostbusters theme song by David Whittaker, which sounds way better than its arcade counterpart. Only problem is it loops pretty quickly and is the only track in the entire game and may lead you to insanity by the game's end. Zap64 rated the game overall as 67%, which I feel is pretty fair. If you're a massive Ghostbusters fan, then either this or the arcade are at least worth trying out for curiosity's sake. As long as as you don't get your hopes up for something brilliant though. And this all leads to 1989's other Activision Ghostbusters release, Ghostbusters 2, based on the movie sequel that was released in the same year. The movie reunites the entire cast from the original and takes place 5 years later, as the Ghostbusters are now considered washed-up hacks.
Ghostbusters doesn't exist.
Due to the fact that no paranormal activity has hit New York since 1984. Ivan Reitman was back in the director's chair again, with Aykroyd and Ramis on writing duties. As a movie sequel, it's kind of disappointing, there's no other way to describe it. It's not a train wreck though, it has really good special effects. Some awesome action set pieces like the courthouse showdown, which is just awesome. Wow! And pockets of humor all over the place that are genuinely funny.
Don't put any of those old cheap moves on me.
No.
It's different.
I have all new cheap moves.
But overall, I think the plot about the Vigo painting and the slum in New York making people go mean was just a bit weak and kind of sucks the life out of everything else.
As I explained before, we think the spirit of a 17th century Moldavian tyrant is alive and well in a painting at the Manhattan Museum of Art.
And are there any other paintings in the museum with bad spirits in them?
You're wasting valuable time. He's drawing strength from a psychomagnetheric slime flow that's been collecting under the city.
Yes, tell me about the slime.
It's very potent stuff. We made a toaster dance with it. And a bathtub tried to eat his friend's baby.
A bathtub?
Don't look at me. I think these people are completely nuts.
It ended up making just over $215 million in its initial theatrical run on a $40 million budget, which managed to actually save Columbia Pictures at the time from going into bankruptcy. So, there's something. I don't think it's a bad movie at all, just don't go into watching it expecting something classic.
You never even had a slinky?
We had part of a slinky, but I straightened it.
Otherwise, it's a fun, forgettable popcorn movie that has its moments.
This is Pensrigo, the roller quartet in Moldavia.
Bit of a sissy, isn't he?
Activision's approach to this game was, let's copy Ocean's formula and just chop it up into a bunch of mini-games with some small story segments in between to link it all together. Unfortunately, the overall outcome is just a real mess of a game. Instead of making something original like the first one, I think they kinda just got lazy and needed something else out really fast, which is pretty evident in the fact that the game only has 3 levels, which barely makes it a game. It's just way too short. Whereas the Ocean movie license games, some of them great, some of them not so much, which at least intersperse their big levels with mini games to boost the amount of content like in RoboCop or even Terminator 2, but Activision just decided not to add any extras. So what you're left with is 3 levels of varying gameplay. The first is Ray's descent into the sewer to get the slime sample, which is directly from the movie. This sequence is actually pretty decent with some okay graphics as you blast your way down while trying to protect your rope from the ghosts that are trying to break it, so you can get that sample at the bottom of the sewer. This is definitely the best level of the game. The second level of the game weirdly jumps right to the end of the movie already with the Statue of Liberty sequence, where the Ghostbusters reanimate the statue for a walkabout. The game then turns into the side-scrolling shoot-'em-up affair that's just a bit of a mess. Boring, uninspired gameplay as you blast ghosts with some really ugly graphics just leads to nothing really, and is almost the worst part of the game, except that there is still a third level. I'm curious as to why they didn't turn the courtroom action scene into a game segment. It seems like such a wasted opportunity. But alas, we head to the third part, which is just pretty pathetic, as you face off against Vigo and save baby Oscar. This level is 2 screens with some really clunky graphics and almost non-existent gameplay, and I would say this barely even counts as a mini-game. It's just a poor ending to a game which they clearly put no effort into. Its only recommended feature is David Whittaker's, again, great rendition of the Ghostbusters theme, as well as the movie's main music tie-in song Higher and Higher, which is actually pretty damn good and well worth listening to. Zap64 blasted this game back to hell it was spawned from with a paltry 39% overall. If you enjoyed the movie, I would highly recommend playing some of the other versions of this game that exist. The excellent Japanese Famicom only release, New Ghostbusters 2, is quite excellent, and 1989's pretty solid DOS version, which is completely different, has a lot more character and levels in the mix than this weak attempt ever did. Okay, so how do all the Ghostbusters games fare up? Well, I feel like the first one is still the best. It's because it doesn't try to imitate pieces of the movie, it just tries to take the main themes of the movie and make a kind of simulation around it. It's a very clever approach, it works really well. I think it's definitely by far the best game in this whole bunch. Real Ghostbusters, it's okay, but I think that's more to do with the fact that the arcade game that it's based on isn't all that great in the first place. It just makes it a mediocre game overall, so in that fact, they actually did a pretty good conversion. And as for Ghostbusters 2, that thing over there, no, just avoid it. It's just terrible. It's not a good game at all. When I played it back in the day, I thought it was okay. Playing it now, it's just awful. It's really weak. There's a lot of other completely different versions of Ghostbusters 2 out there. Like I mentioned in the video, you should probably just check those out instead. Just don't go for the 8 and 16-bit micro versions. Those are the ones that follow this formula. The Amiga one's the same, Spectrum and all that kind of stuff, so just avoid those ones. The DOS one was also made by Activision and Dynamics, by the way. That is completely different, so don't get those confused, even though it has the same cover. So there's that, and also that Famicom only New Ghostbusters 2, freaking excellent. Check that one out too. And thanks for joining me, Bastish B, at 64K. I hope you had a good time. If you can like and subscribe, that would be greatly appreciated. I'll see you next time. Cheers.